Our story takes place in Rockledge, Florida, back in 1973. My mother had purchased an Ouija board from the toy department at a local department store. Ouija boards back then did not have the reputation they have today. My mother and sister one day decided to play with the board and solicited me to record a written record of their questions and answers. Though I have since lost it, for some reason I kept the piece of paper for over 20 years. One day, approximately 20 years later, I was looking at it and realized that all the predictions the board had made so many years earlier had amazingly came true. One of the first questions asked was what was the spirit's name? It answered Dan Worth. My mother's maiden name was Worthington. She later wondered if the surname Worth was an abbreviation for Worthington. Admittedly, she was unaware of any deceased relatives on my grandfather's side of the family named Dan. Being 15 years old at the time, my sister asked questions that one might expect from a 15-year-old girl, such as will she get married and how many kids will she have? The board answered that she would marry twice and that she would have 4 children, which came true. The board correctly predicted that my sister would have 2 boys and 2 girls. Like our mother, my sister has 2 sons and 2 daughters. The board also predicted that my sister's first husband would be named Mike. My sister's first husband's name was Mike. The board also correctly predicted that my sister's second husband's name would be Mark. My sister's second husband's name was Mark. The board correctly predicted that my sister and her first husband would struggle financially. Mike was a jockey, and my sister and he traveled from racetrack to racetrack and experienced periods of unemployment. The board correctly predicted that my sister and her second husband would be well off, financially speaking. Mark was a veterinarian, and they lived very comfortably. I do not recall all the questions that were asked, as it's been almost 50 years ago, and I lost the paper on which I had written the questions and answers about 30 years ago. But I do recall that when I read the paper some 20 years later, all of the answers and predictions had remarkably came true. After my mother and sister were finished asking questions, I begged them to ask a question that was very important to me. I have been a political junkie, most say nerd, since I was 4 years old. My question was who was going to win the 1976 presidential election, which was still 3 years out. The board correctly answered, Carter. For the record, neither my mother nor sister had any idea who Jimmy Carter was. I knew who he was, but even I would have never guessed that he would run for, let alone win the presidency, in 1976. He was a first-term governor of the state of Georgia. No Southerner had won the presidency in over 100 years. Southerner Strom Thurmond formed the Dixiecrat Party and ran for president in 1948. He received a little over 2% of the vote and won 4 states. Southerner George Wallace formed the American Independent Party and ran for president in 1968. He received over 13% of the vote and won 5 states. No one seriously thought anyone from the South would win the presidency anytime soon. This is my autographed photograph of then Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. In 1972, President Nixon won re-election by a landslide, but by 1973, his popularity had taken a nosedive, and the Watergate scandal was just about to erupt. This is one of my autographed photographs of President Richard Nixon. At the time of my mother and sister's Ouija board session, had anyone asked who would win the 1976 presidential election, which was still 3 years out, the vast majority of Americans, and political scientists alike, would have answered the popular Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, brother of President John Kennedy, who had been assassinated in 1963, and New York Senator Robert Kennedy, who had been assassinated in 1968. This is one of my autographed photographs of Senator Kennedy. With respect to Jimmy Carter's prospects of running for, let alone winning the presidency in 1976, my mother and sister were not the only ones who had never heard of him, as demonstrated by his 1973 appearance on the popular television game show, What's My Line? Please note that the celebrity panelists were not even required to wear blindfolds.
Would our first challenger enter and sign in, please? X. Panel, all I can tell you about Mr. X is that he provides a service, and we will now show the audience who our guest is and what his line is.
I'm not a major fan of Ouija boards, as I've always suspected that at least one of the participants is pushing the planchette, even if only subconsciously. I have noticed that when one of the players is a poor speller, or is accustomed to misspelling a certain word, the alleged spirit also seems to misspell that same word. It seems that just within the past decade or so, Ouija boards have enjoyed renewed popularity and/or fear, at least in the paranormal world. Almost everyone will tell you, don't mess with them. I'm not so sure that this is from any special power in the Ouija boards themselves, as opposed to a really strong campaign by their manufacturer designed to increase sales, including numerous movies. In any event, I found it interesting that during my mother and sister's Ouija board session back in 1973, that it correctly predicted the number of times my sister would marry, her husband's names, the number and sex of their children, and that the then obscure Jimmy Carter would become president 3 years later. I'm Ghost Hunter Joe, and this is my Ouija board story. See you next time.